Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Live with RYE. I'm your host RYE, and I am so thrilled you are joining me today. I just want to thank you for your continued love and support. It means so much to me, and I truly could not do this without you. So thank you. Before we begin though, I do have a favor to ask of you. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button and subscribe to my YouTube channel below so you never miss an episode of Live with RYE. You're also helping the channel out as well. And if you're joining us on Facebook, hit that thumbs up button and like our Facebook page. You can also follow me across social media at RYE the News Guy on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I love hearing from you, and let's continue this conversation. So follow me at RYE the News Guy. And finally, you'll see my website scrolling across the bottom of the screen, ryenewsguy.com. Head over there to rewatch all episodes of Live with RYE and to see all of my other exclusive interviews and content, and to see the launch of my new production company, RYE Entertainment. You'll also see my Venmo handle scrolling across the bottom of the screen as well. If you are so inclined, please feel free to support Live with RYE and our website, ryenewsguy.com. Your support means so much to me, and I truly cannot thank you enough. Now, let's get on with today's show. Please help me welcome my very special guest, New York Times bestselling author and theater critic, and author of the brand new book, Singular Sensation, The Triumph of Broadway. Help me welcome my guest, Michael Riedel. Hey, Michael.
How are you?
I'm good, thanks.
You've got so many social media platforms. I mean, I don't know how people follow you. You're on this one and that one and this one, and you got a Venmo here, and you're on Instagram, and you're on YouTube, and you're on, I don't know. I mean, listen, I'm an old newspaper guy. When I was your age, we used to go, when I was your age, I was at the New York Daily News, and you know, you would write a great story. I remember a couple of scoops I had back in those days about Sunset Boulevard, Andrew Lloyd Webber show.
Right.
They were on the front page of the Daily News. And I remember you'd get up early in the morning, put the story to bed around 5 o'clock the night before. And then you couldn't wait to get to the newsstand at 6 in the morning. And you'd pick up the Daily News, and there was your front page story. And you owned that story, that front page story, all day long. And all the TV and the radio and the other papers, they had to follow you all day long. Now you got a scoop. It lasts about 30 seconds. Then everybody else has got it, and it's no longer yours anymore. And that's it. So
yeah, exactly.
You guys live in a different world from where I came from.
Well, yes. And I agree. Unfortunately, in today's, I guess the blessing and curse of today's society is, you have to have social media and all those social platforms. It's no longer that gratification, like you said, back where you could just have your story and, you know, have them follow you all day with it. You have to have all different social platforms. So
I've never been a social media guy because, I've been around long enough to know that when I'm drinking after a Broadway show with a bunch of stagehands, some of the things that we say, which we think are hilarious at the bar at Joe Allen's, might not be so funny if I were to tweet them out on Twitter. And I would get fired for most of the conversations I've had with people over the years in the theater world. I remember at one point at the New York Post, where I was the theater columnist for until I was furloughed for 20, 25 years. They wanted us all to be on social media. And everyone said, okay, well, you know, you got to tweet, you got Instagram, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But then they made you sign this thing that said, if you tweet or Instagram or say on social media anything that is offensive or the paper deems to be inappropriate, we can fire you. And I went to my editor and I said, look, I've been in the newspaper racket a long time. I have 4 editors and I have 3 lawyers who look at everything that I write. And once you guys sign off on it, I'm indemnified. If somebody sues me, and I've been sued before, you guys protect me. If I am at a bar at 2 a.m, you know, slagging off with some stagehands about some actors, we say terrible things, I think that's hilarious. I tweet it. You're telling me I'm not protected? I can be fired the next day? I said, I am not doing social media.
Yeah.
I don't do it. I just don't do it. I've never done it.
Yeah. Well, I don't blame you. It's you know, it's crazy time that we're in right now. And I certainly don't blame you. And yeah, everything's out there for everyone to see for sure. So tell me, what inspired you to write Singular Sensation, The Triumph of Broadway, and to focus on the era in which you did? I'm sure you didn't expect to write the foreword that you did about Broadway closing due to a global pandemic as well.
Well, the only thing that inspires me is contracts and money. And I finished this book called Razzle Dazzle, The Battle for Broadway for Simon & Schuster. that came out in 2015. And Simon and Schuster signed me up for another book. And I thought, oh my God, I mean, I'm a newspaper man. If you give me an assignment, I deliver it. Yeah. I thought, I got to figure out something to do. And my first book, Razzle Dazzle, which it's a different kind of a book. It's a little, I have to say, a little meatier than Singular Sensation, because it's really about how Broadway helped kind of save New York City in the 60s and 70s. And, people forget, or young people such as yourself don't know that, in the 70s, this was not a good city to be in. And Broadway was in a lot of trouble. Times Square was dangerous. Pimps and prostitutes and porno houses. That was Times Square. There were no tourists coming there because people were afraid to come to New York City. And I just had this idea that the one thing New York had going for it in the 60s and 70s was Broadway. And there were a handful of people who stuck by Broadway, the Schuberts, the Nederlanders, people like Joe Papp at the Public Theater, Michael Bennett, who did a chorus line. They kind of stuck by Broadway, and they gave us some shows like Equus, A Chorus Line, Dreamgirls, that sort of held it together. And as Broadway's fortunes grew in the 1980s with Andrew Lloyd Webber shows, Cats and Phantom, and Cameron McIntosh doing Les Mis and Miss Saigon, that really helped reestablish New York as a place that people wanted to go to, because only on Broadway were you going to be able to see the Phantom of the Opera. Only on Broadway were you going to be able to see A Chorus Line. And so I wrote that book, and I ended it at the end of the 80s, the early 90s. And I thought, okay, that's a pretty good book. I'm proud of that book. And then I signed this contract with Simon and Schuster, and they said, we want another book. I said, well, I mean, what am I going to write about? And I began to think, I said, you know what? I covered the 90s on Broadway for the Daily News and the New York Post. And the 90s, key decade for Broadway. Andrew Lloyd Webber and Cameron McIntosh with Cats, Les Mis, Phantom, they kind of pushed Broadway a little bit more into the mainstream of American popular culture because those shows were successful. Mm-hmm. But in the 90s, when you had Rent, and you had Chicago, and you had The Lion King, and you had Mel Brooks's The Producers, those shows were as popular as any movie or TV show back then. And that was the moment where Broadway really, in a way it had not been since probably the 40s or the 50s, was back in the mainstream of American popular culture. And I remember thinking, so this is an interesting thing to write about. And then it occurred to me, Rosie O'Donnell, she had that hugely popular talk show. Yeah. And she was the ambassador of Broadway to Middle America. I mean, 8 million people watched her show every morning. And she put Broadway people on. She made those shows famous. And I thought, that's something to write about. I thought, well, where do you end? Where do I end the book? And I thought, well, I could take it up to Hamilton, because, I mean, Hamilton is, one of the most famous titles in the history of showbiz, right?
Oh, yeah.
But that book would have been about 8,000 pages. And I would have died writing it, and you would have died reading it. And then it occurred to me, because I live down here in the West Village. And one day, as I was kind of plotting out the book in my mind, I looked out my window. I thought, I used to have a straight on shot from my living room window of the World Trade Center. And I saw the planes hit the Twin Towers, and I saw the Twin Towers fall. And I lived through what we thought was Broadway's existential crisis, which was, how do you come back after a terrorist attack on New York?
Yeah.
And I was there for it. I mean, within 2 days, September 13th, Thursday, after that Tuesday, September 11th, at the urging of Rudy Giuliani, when he was a sane human being, he said, I want to show the world that New York is not going to be brought to its knees by terrorists. And the best way to do that is to show the world we've got one thing that no one else has, and that's Broadway. And I want the lights lit on Thursday night, and I want those shows up. And I went with Mel Brooks and Anne Bancroft to see The Producers that night, September 13th, 2001. And we stood at the back of the house, and we watched Nathan Lane and Matthew Broderick do a show for maybe 500 people. The theater wasn't packed because people were afraid, but 500 people did come. And Matthew and Nathan, they led those 500 people, my being one of them, in tears singing God Bless America. And I thought, that is how you end. That's how you end this book. The 90s were such a big moment for Broadway. And just at its height, this awful, awful thing happened. And we didn't think we could recover. And Broadway did. And it did. And that's why I call it the Triumph of Broadway. was an ironic title. I finished the book in February.
Yeah.
In Switzerland as a treat for myself, having finished the book. I got back the second week of March, and all of a sudden Broadway shut down for God knows how long. So I never intended the subtitle of the book, The Triumph of Broadway, to be ironic. But listen, so much of our lives is out of our hands.
Yes, it is. Well, and it's great that you ended the book how you did. I think it takes readers through the sort of the perfect era, as you said, and you leave it right at Hamilton. And so you say that. It's interesting because how has this book for you taken on a new meaning in the era of COVID? And do you think the line Triumph of Broadway is truer than ever today?
Well, I mean, problem is, if you were a diabolical person and you really wanted to kill Broadway, you could not come up with anything better than the coronavirus. Okay. Mm-hmm. Actors have to be together in rehearsals. They have to kiss each other in a romantic scene. They have to enunciate. That's how you spread the coronavirus. You go down into the pit, the orchestra, everybody in close quarters. As you know, I'm sure you've been into pits in these Broadway shows. They're all blowing on instruments. Again, that's how you spread the virus. I don't think you really can come back with Broadway until there is a vaccine and the actors and the musicians and the ushers and the stagehands all feel comfortable going back to work. But that's going to take some time. And then the unknown is, when you can open Broadway, and I don't think it's going to open until 2022, frankly, but when you can reopen Broadway, when does the audience feel comfortable coming back?
Yeah.
I mean, Broadway was huge business in the 90s and in the 2000s. The tourists from all over the world were pouring into New York. You could charge $1,000 to see Hamilton and people would pay it.
Yeah.
Extraordinary to me. I mean, those prices were obscene, frankly.
Yeah.
But people were paying it. But New York was the epicenter of the pandemic in the beginning, and now we got the spike coming again, and they're talking about another lockdown. When are people around the world going to feel comfortable coming to New York City and going to see a Broadway show? And that is something that none of us can answer. And September 11th, you wanted to be together. It was such an awful moment, but you wanted to come together. People wanted to be in a theater. They wanted to enjoy life once again. There was a communal feeling of being together. And this pandemic says you can't be together, because if you're together, that's how the virus spreads. And you can't have a theater where we can't be together.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And later on, I'm going to get to, with sort of the return to Broadway and with how they sort of open. But it's interesting you talk about that, because there are sort of some parallels between the attacks on 9/11 and the recovery of Broadway and sort of COVID. What parallels do you think are there? I mean, we have so many, as you mentioned. The one is with 9/11, people were together. They wanted to be together. We were about community. Now, we can't be together. Everybody wants to be together. If you're together, you're causing and spreading this horrible disease. What are some of the other parallels between both the events that have affected Broadway? I mean, each have impacted Broadway in the city so terribly. I mean,
I do think when people, and we're going to have a vaccine. I mean, from everything I've heard, that we are going to have a vaccine, and it will be okay once again, and we'll learn to live with this thing. And people have been deprived of an experience of Broadway, of live theater, for a long time, and they will be eager and they will want to come back. I think what's going to have to change, though, is you cannot come out of this pandemic and say to people, by the way, we're reopening Hamilton and we're going to still charge you $1,000. People have been out of work for a long time. And the only good thing that I see that can come out of this is that those crazy, obscene ticket prices are going to have to come down, so that people say, you know what, I'm going to take the chance. I can see Hamilton not for $1,000, but for $150.
Yeah,
and I'm willing to take that chance with a vaccine, feeling safe. And Broadway has got to figure out its economic structure so it can entice people back to the theater at prices that they can afford. And before the pandemic, and listen, I'm a capitalist, and all my friends on Broadway, they take big risks, as you know, RYE, and I do not begrudge them the money that they make. They lay it on the line, and oftentimes they fail. So when they hit, it's great because it gives them more money to do other shows. So I never begrudge them the prices that they were charging. But there was a moment there where I thought things are just getting a little too much for the 1%. And my fear was there's no future in the theater if you just make it for the 1%. Because, Michael Bennett, whom I wrote about in my first book, Razzle Dazzle, Michael Bennett, he left his high school one day and came to New York with no money, but he saw every Broadway show. And he became Michael Bennett because he saw every Broadway show because he could afford to see it. I mean, you can't have a theater that's only going to be run by trust fund babies because they're the only people who could afford a ticket to Hamilton.
Yeah.
So I do think when Broadway comes back, it has to come back at a reasonable price and not be for the 1% anymore, and just bring everybody in to see a great show.
I totally agree. And it's funny you say that, because it actually sort of brings me to my next question, which is this economic model that Broadway has. As you said, I can't also imagine people wanting to pay these obscene premium prices for Hamilton for other shows. Is it really going to come down to, and this is sort of something I've been, I think, a proponent that's going to have to happen, is it going to come down to us being sort of the higher ups of Broadway who control the reopening, rolling up our sleeves and reworking this financial model to say, listen, we're going to have to make it work at having lower ticket prices, at possibly having a low capacity for a bit until until there's enough of a knowing of a vaccine that you can have a full, theater? Is it going to sort of come down to having to rework the financial model?
I was talking to Rocco Landisman, who's a big character in my book, Singular Sensation, The Triumph of Broadway, because Rocco saved Hugh Jampson Theaters when he took it over, and Rocco produced Angels in America, and he produced that great revival of Guys and Dolls that made a star of Nathan Lane. Yeah. All those things I detail in the book, and he ultimately wound up producing, Mel Brooks as the producers. And Rocco and we were doing an event at the 92nd Street Y the other night on Zoom, of course, because everything's
Yeah.
And Rocco said there's no question about it. When Broadway reopens, they have to restructure the finances and the ticket prices to say to people, come to see a show, not at $1,000, come to see a show at $100, at $75. And he said, his feeling is you have to get people back to the theater, get them in, so that then they say, we went, it was safe, we felt comfortable, we had a great time. You cannot reopen Broadway and say, hey, we're back in business, folks. It's business as usual before the pandemic, and we're going to charge you $1 gazillion to come see our wares. That cannot happen. And it's going to take negotiations with the theater owners and the unions and producers to kind of unravel this financial structure that has been built for so long on sky-high ticket prices. Yeah,
I agree. And it almost, in my view too, it's like you can't have a Broadway if you can't refigure a model, right? I mean, every industry is sort of refiguring out their model, and of course, Broadway is very unique than any other industry. But so many other industries have had to rework their financial model. I think I have been someone that has been saying a lot of people have said we can't come back until Broadway can have full capacity. But I think, as you said, if you want people to think it's safe, you're going to have to have it where Broadway's at 50% capacity. And we say, hey, listen, it's safe. We've social distance, we have the vaccine, but, come back and support the arts, because people want to get back to work. The artists, the stagehands, the ushers, and I think it comes down to not, the greed. I think, we have to look at, people over profit in the long run.
It's funny. In the 90s on Broadway, which is about, my book, Singular Sensation, that's the decade it concentrates on. One of the things I wanted to get across was that nobody who did these shows, Rent, Chicago, The Lion King, the producers, nobody ever knew how big these shows would be. And so in the book, I try to take you back and put you in the minds of the people who created them. So Jonathan Larson, there's a lot of myth that has surrounded Jonathan Larson. For one thing, people think he died of AIDS. He didn't. He died of an aneurysm. But people just assume because the musical's about AIDS that he died of AIDS. Right. And people also think he came out of nowhere. All of a sudden, overnight, Jonathan Larson had this big hit and he died just before it opened, and that was tragic. Jonathan Larson had been a kid knocking around New York for 10 to 15 years. He was 35, 36 when he wrote Rent. He was not young. He had been struggling. He'd written a number of shows. They got on in off-Broadway places. They never really went anywhere. And he was at the end of his rope when he was writing Rent. And so, for this book, I went back and I interviewed a lot of people who knew him well. And they all told me, they all said, Jonathan was really, he thought, if this show doesn't go, I've got to figure out the rest of my life because I can't make a living. I can't survive anymore writing musicals. It's not going to happen for me. Yeah. And he was really, really desperate. And I try to convey that in the chapters about Rent, how this was his last chance. He thought, if this one doesn't work, I don't know what I'm going to do, but I can't do this anymore. Yeah. And it's that kind of that struggle that so many theater people have. Nobody's an overnight success. As you go into the theater and you keep working and you keep working and you keep working.
Yes.
And you're lucky if you hit it for that one time. And the tragedy of Jonathan Larson is he hit it, but he didn't live to see how he hit it. Because, after that, and I really went back and I interviewed the actors and I interviewed my friends who were involved in the show, the publicists, the producer of the show, Jim Nicola, down at New York Theater Workshop. I said, I don't want you to project ahead and to know what happens to Jonathan. I want you to tell me, what was that final dress rehearsal like when Jonathan was alive and with you? Yeah. And I remember I interviewed Angela Wendt, who did the great costumes for Rent. And she told me when they were doing the dress rehearsal down there at the New York Theater Workshop that Jonathan was sitting behind her. And I can't remember the name of the drag queen in the show, Angel. Angel came out in his Santa Claus costume because they were having a New Year's Eve party or something like that. And Jonathan leaned over, he put his hand on Angela's shoulder, the costume designer, and he saw Angel in that Santa Claus costume. And he said, I just love it. I just love it. And an hour later, he was meeting with Anthony Tomasini, who was New York Times opera critic, who was interviewing Jonathan. People don't know this, but he was not interviewing Jonathan about Rent. He was interviewing Jonathan Larson about the 100th anniversary of La Boheme that Rent was based on. So Tomasini was going to write an article about the 100th anniversary of Puccini's La Boheme. And in the meantime, there's this little show that you've never heard of down in the village that is based on La Boheme. So that was what the interview was about. And I remember my friend Don Suma, who was the publicist for Rent. I said, can you tell me the last time you saw Jonathan? He said, yeah, I'll never forget it. We had to find a quiet place for him to be interviewed by the famous opera critic from the New York Times. And Jonathan was thrilled because he grew up reading the New York Times in Westchester. So for him to be interviewed by the New York Times, for him was the most exciting thing in his life.
Yeah.
And Don, the publicist, told me, he said, I walked out of the theater and we put Jonathan and Anthony Tomasini in the box office because it was quiet. It could be a quiet place to do the interview. And Jonathan was tall and he had this big black bushy hair. And Don caught sight of Jonathan's eyes just above the ledge of the box office. And he said, I looked at those eyes and he seemed tired. He seemed a little distracted, but excited because he was being interviewed by the New York Times. And an hour later, Jonathan Larson goes home by himself to his walk-up apartment, not too far from where I live here in the West Village, not feeling well, and puts on the tea kettle and drops dead of an aneurysm. He's dead before he hits his kitchen floor. And his roommate, who was around the corner at the Ear Bar down here in the West Village here, his roommate was waiting for him to come to have a drink with him to celebrate the dress rehearsal. And Jonathan didn't show up, and his roommate was drinking and came home about 3 a.m. and found Jonathan dead on the floor.
It is such a tragedy. And I often wonder, if he, could have just been around to see the success of Rent. And I think that, him passing, I think obviously also gave the show such an even more of a special meaning, but to be able to have him see his beautiful show touch so many lives and change so many lives, it is such a tragedy what happened. And, reading that chapter specifically, I didn't realize how much he had struggled for so long. And this was his, his sort of, he was at the end of his ropes. And, Rent has changed theater history forever. And I no small part thanks to Jonathan,
Well, I mean, listen, Lin-Manuel Miranda saw Rent 30 times, so there's no Hamilton without Rent. But I mean, the important thing about Rent, and I really try to get at this in the book, because, as a kind of a historian, if you will, of Broadway, you're looking for moments that change, that shift things. So you have the 80s, and you've got the British invasion. You have Cats and Les Mis and Phantom, Miss Saigon. They're big spectacles. And they're British, it's Cameron Mackintosh and Andrew Lloyd Webber, and they're spending $20 million on a show. And everything has to have special effects and turntables and helicopters and chandeliers and, tires that, Betty Buckley goes up to the Heaviside layer with lots of smoke going on underneath her.
Yes.
So everything's big. Everything's huge. The last one of those shows, and I open the book with this, is Andrew Lloyd Webber's Sunset Boulevard, which, by the way, I think is a terrific show. It is a beautiful score. And two of Andrew's greatest songs, With One Look and If We Never Said Goodbye. Great theatrical songs. I mean, just the muscularity of a theatrical song. That, a diva like Glenn Close or Betty Buckley or Patti LuPone before she got fired could sing the hell out of those songs. But I covered Sunset Boulevard, and I remember it was not in the news because it was good. It was in the news because it was riven with scandal. Yes. Andrew fought with Patti LuPone. He fired her. He had to pay her $1 million. He hired Faye Dunaway to do the LA production. He had to fire her because she wasn't good. He had a big falling out with Glenn Close when she was on Broadway. And so the whole thing was in the news because of scandal. Yeah. And we didn't realize it at the time, but the show was so expensive. It was like $14 or $15 million, the most expensive show of all time. And it was just, the production was so lavish. But I do remember thinking because I went to the opening night of Sunset Boulevard, I do remember thinking, this is actually an intimate story. Okay, it's Norma Desmond, Joe Gillis, and the butler. It's just three people. And yet this gigantic production is put on this kind of intimate story. I mean, the mansion had to fly. They spent $1.5 million just on the Norma Desmond's mansion alone that had to fly. And the car, the famous car that she drives up the Paramount Studios, they spent $500,000 on the car. And I remember thinking, this is a very intimate story, but the production is so heavy. It's just, it's so big. And what happened was ultimately Sunset Boulevard imploded. It collapsed on itself. And there was a moment where Andrew, and I put this in the book, he shut down every single production of Sunset Boulevard around the world because his accountants told him, it's not working. It's not going to make any money. If you don't shut it down, your company is going to be in trouble. And he just wiped it out. And the show that comes after Sunset Boulevard, Andrew wins the Tony Award in 1995 for Sunset Boulevard. And in 1996, Andrew presents the Tony Award posthumously to Jonathan Larson, who wrote a show that had no chandelier, no barricade, no flying mansion, no flying helicopter. It was done for about $100,000 off Broadway. And it was American, and it was young, and it was contemporary. And that's how I begin the book. The shift happens. The British invasion is over. Jonathan Larson begins the Americans taking Broadway back again.
Yeah, the beautiful explosion of the American theater. What do you think that was your favorite chapter to write, the chapter on Sunset Boulevard in the opening, or did you have a favorite chapter other than that, if that wasn't it?
Well, my favorite chapter to write was, and I kind of snuck this in because it's not really Broadway, but it did have some Broadway shows. I was, as a student at Columbia in the 1980s, I took a class with this kind of down and out playwright by the name of Edward Albee. And Edward, of course, had written Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf and The Zoo Story and A Delicate Balance. But in the 80s, Edward was kind of the forgotten man. He'd had a bunch of flops on Broadway and nobody gave Edward Albee the time of day. And to be honest with you, when I took the class, I really didn't know who he was. And I thought, well, I better, learn about my professor. So I went to the library at Columbia and I took down the play Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. And I'll never forget this, RYE. I started reading it. And I sat there in the stacks of the Columbia Library. I read it cover to cover. I thought, I've never read anything like this. And then I got to know Edward, and we were friends. And when I became a theater reporter for the Daily News, whenever Edward had a little play being done somewhere, I would always interview him. But no one else would. I mean, he was like, the guy had so many flops. He was written off by all the critics. He was like, poor old Tennessee Williams. He was just had a great moment in time, but the critics cast Tennessee Williams out of the kingdom by the end of his life, and he died, choking on a bottle cap by himself in a hotel room because he was drunk. And sad to say, I think Edward was headed that way, and I'll never forget Edward. Edward appreciated the fact that I would write about him, in Little Theater Week magazine back in the day. And one day we had lunch, and Edward was very inscrutable. And he said, "Hello, Michael, how are you?" "Hi, Edward, I'm fine." I said, "I'm glad to hear you're fine. I hope you continue being fine," he would say. And then one day at lunch, he said, "I've written a new play, and I'd be curious." I'll never forget this. "I'd be curious to know what you think." And he gave me a play called Three Tall Women, which is about his mother. And I remember reading that play, and I had the same experience reading that play, Three Tall Women, as I had reading Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf for the first time. I thought, my God, there is something crackling here. Edward could not get a New York producer to do that play. The premiere of Three Tall Women was in Vienna because nobody was buying a new Edward Albee play. And then it did come to upstate New York. It was done at a small theater in Westchester and the Vineyard Theater, fine off-Broadway theater.
Yeah.
He picked it up. The critics rediscovered Edward Albee. And Three Tall Women won the Pulitzer Prize and began Edward's amazing second act in the American theater. You had then a phenomenal revival of A Delicate Balance that Lincoln Center did with Elaine Stritch and George Grizzard and Rosemary Harris. And then you had a great revival of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf on Broadway with Kathleen Turner and Bill Irwin. And then Edward, at 75 years old, he wrote this play called The Goat, or Who is Sylvia, on Broadway, which shocked audiences. I mean, it's a play about this comfortable architect who falls in love with a goat. He literally falls in love with a goat and brings the goat home. And audience members were like, what? This is insane. And I remember sitting with Edward, and when people would walk out of they would be so incensed, they'd walk out. Edward loved it. He loved it. He said, I could still get under their skin. So my favorite chapter in the book is, I think it's chapter 8, Who's Afraid of Edward Albee, because his return as a great American playwright. And it shows you again in the 90s, the plays come back. You have Angels in America with Tony Kushner. Suddenly, that's a play that everybody's talking about. Everybody's talking about Angels in America. And then Edward comes back with Three Tall Women. And then all those great revivals that he did. And then The Goat, or Who is Sylvia. So the chapter on Edward, and I cheated a bit because the book's about Broadway, and Three Tall Women technically was off Broadway, but Edward did have his big revival on Broadway. And there was that great Broadway revival with Glenda Jackson.
Yes.
Three Tall Women, which was magnificent.
Yeah, that was incredible. With that, and Glenn Close was in that as well, if I recall.
No, Glenn was in A Delicate Balance. There was
A Delicate Balance, correct.
Which was not such a great production, I have to be honest with you on that.
Correct. Yes, I got that confused. There were so many chapters that stuck out to me, and so many things that struck me, but particularly the one chapter that I found interesting was the rise and fall of Garth Drabinsky. What made Garth so different from these big producers we see today who still throw tons of monies at shows and advertising? And do you think that Garth really ever thought he would get caught in what he was doing? Or do you think he thought that everyone else was oblivious and he could get away with it?
I think psychopaths always think they'll get away with it.
Yeah.
And Garth Drabinsky, he came from the movie business. He invented Cineplex Odeon. And Garth was the person who had, multiplexes. He created multiplexes. And he had a big film company, big Cineplex company. And he went into business with Lou Wasserman at MCA Universal back in the 80s. And the thing about Garth Drabinsky was he believed you had to spend a lot of money, but he had to spend other people's money. So he was always raising money from other people and spending their money to create everything that had to be big and gigantic. And when Garth, and I tell this story in the book, when Garth went into business with Lou Wasserman and MCA Universal, they thought, this guy's terrific. He's great. I mean, he's created the multiplex. We've got to be in business with him. But very early on, they thought, this guy also spends a lot of money. And there's no real proper accounting for where the money's coming from and where the money's going. And that whole partnership blew up. And they ended the deal with Garth. And as part of his settlement package, Garth had gotten the Canadian rights to Phantom of the Opera. So when they kicked Garth out of his own company that he created, they said, all right, here's your exit package, and you get to do the Phantom in Toronto. And Garth did an amazing production of the Phantom of the Opera in Toronto. I mean, it was great. Colm Wilkinson, I went up to see it. It was absolutely sensational.
Yeah.
He spent more money on it than Andrew Lloyd Webber spent on the Broadway production. And it was an enormous hit. And Garth thought, there is money to be made in live theater. And he created this company called Live End that floated shares on the stock exchanges in New York and Canada. You could buy a share of Live End. And Garth was going to do all these shows. He did Kiss of a Spider Woman. He did wonderful revival of Showboat that Hal Prince directed. He did Ragtime. And everything looked great, except for a couple of things that a few of us noticed at the time. Because if you know anything about the economics of Broadway, you thought, Garth is really spending a lot of money on these shows. He's spending a lot of money to promote them. I mean, most Broadway producers, you take, one full-page ad back in those days in the New York Times to advertise your show. Garth would take 3. He would take 3. I mean, that's like $500,000 that you bought for, one Sunday. And, a lot of my old friends on Broadway are like, I can't figure this out. He's got these shows. They seem to be hits. They're running. But are they really kicking off that much money to support everything that he's doing? He was buying theaters. He was building theaters. He was expanding. And then he came up with Ragtime, a terrific show, by the way.
Yes.
But he made, and I detail this in the book, he made a huge strategic error. Ragtime opened in Toronto in 1996. And that season on Broadway was kind of weak. I think the contenders for the Tony Award that year were Titanic, The Life, and Steel Pier. Titanic's a great show, but The Life and Steel Pier, they were not very good. Garth could have brought Ragtime down from Toronto into New York that year, onto Broadway that year, and he would have won every award in sight. But because his ego is so colossal and he's building this Ford Center Theater, Times Square, he wants Ragtime to be the show that christens the Ford Center, right? And the Ford Center is not ready to go in 1996. It's going to be ready to go in 1997, 1998. Mm-hmm. So he says, no, I'm going to take Ragtime to LA, and then I'm going to bring it into New York, 1998. Well, what happens between, 1996 up in Toronto and 1998 is Disney comes up with this show called The Lion King, directed by Julie Taymor.
Never heard of it.
And The Lion King explodes in the fall of 1997. And Garth comes in with Ragtime, February, I think it opened January of 1998. And it was, and I lay this all out in the book. The competition between The Lion King and Ragtime for the Tony Award was fierce and intense. And at the end of the day, you can go on YouTube and you can see Nathan Lane presenting the award for Best Musical. And he says, in the award for Best Musical, he reads the nominees, Ragtime and The Lion King. And Nathan opens the envelope. He says, and the award for Best Musical 1998 goes to, and his eyebrows go right up to the top of Radio City Music Hall. He says, The Lion King. And right then and there, as a reporter covering Garth, knowing how much money he was spending, I thought, hey, this is going to be a problem for him. And within about a year, as we now know, as I detail in the book, it turned out that Garth's company, Live Ent, was a total fraud. He literally kept 2 sets of books. He had one set of books that you showed to all the investors and all the regulators and all the stock market people that said, every show's a hit, we're making tons of money. And he had the secret set of books that said, we're losing tons of money, we're overspending. The sea of red ink is getting deeper and deeper and deeper. And at the end of the day, Garth Drabinsky went to jail for fraud and forgery, and Livent went bankrupt.
Yeah. And he was also, from what I gathered in the book, what I read, was just also not a nice human, from what it seemed like, at least how he treated people.
He's a complicated guy. I mean, I've known him for a long time. I've certainly had my run-ins with him. We've had some fun times together, but also times where, he's been yelling at me or I've been yelling at him. I would say at the end of the day, I do believe with Garth that he did want to do great work. And he did great work. I mean, Right Time's a terrific show. Barrymore, that play he did with Christopher Plummer, is a wonderful play, and Chris was terrific in it. Kiss of the Spider Woman is a good show. He wanted to do great work, but there was another side of him that was dark and strange and inauthentic, and a little scary. And he was a bully, I have to say. I mean, if you read the chapters on him, the way he treated people on his staff was pretty horrific. And you could get away with that today.
No,
he would have these big marketing meetings, and he would always target someone at the marketing meeting, someone that he wanted just to single out for ridicule, to humiliate in front of everyone else. And then he'd call the chauffeur and, I want to eat, bring me, matzo ball soup from the deli, bring me a sandwich. And then he would eat in front of everybody at the meeting, but he wouldn't give them any food. So it was just, it's an insane kind of person in a way.
Yeah, very insane for sure. But it was very interesting to also read. Now, in this new era and rebirth of Broadway that will come from when we reopen, do you think that we will see an explosion of plays rather than musicals when we return? Or do you think that Broadway that returns will be sort of the flashy, big musical of Broadway? Because right before we did see a lot of plays.
Yeah, I don't think it can be as flashy as it was. And I think that's because, you're going to have to restructure the economics so the ticket prices can be cheaper, which means shows that are going to be cheaper to produce. So maybe if there's a silver lining to this whole nonsense with the pandemic, maybe Broadway comes back again with smaller plays, the kind of plays that the new Edward Albee is writing, the new Tony Kushner is writing. Mm-hmm. And producers are going to have to take a chance again on work that is a little bit more experimental to bring people in. You can't come back and say, hey, we want to do another jukebox musical. We want to do another cartoon movie. Right. The audience is not going to really be there for that, because that audience is a tourist audience. That's an out-of-town audience. You've got to have stuff that's going to bring New Yorkers back to the theater first. And New Yorkers are not going to go see a new Beauty and the Beast. They're just not. They're not interested. So you got to find new and exciting work, plays, musicals, dealing with what we're going through right now, written by crazy, eccentric people like a Jonathan Larson or an Edward Albee. Yeah. And you have to make Broadway artistic again and not tourist anymore.
Yeah, no, and I totally agree. And on that same sort of aspect, something I found interesting, as you talk about in the book, just again, 2 days after the 9/11 attacks, former Mayor Rudy Giuliani, he was adamant about getting Broadway back up and getting the city spirits back up. He also, as we know, really cleaned up the area, including 42nd Street, thanks to Disney. Now, when Broadway returns, will there sort of need to be that kind of support from the city about making sure that people get back to the theater, support live arts? Do you see possibly another I Love New York or New York campaign saying, NYC, we're back, come visit Broadway, sort of to inspire people to come back to the theater?
Well, I will tell you this because I'm in touch with him, and actually he lives across the street from me. When Broadway reopens, there will be one person leading the march down Broadway through Times Square to herald the opening of Broadway. Mm-hmm. And I guarantee you it will be a commercial. And the person who will be front and center in that commercial, who will be front and center of leading the return to Broadway, will be one Hugh Jackman in The Music Man. And Hugh is ready to go. So when you come up with that TV commercial, I can give you 100% guarantee Hugh Jackman will be front and center in that television commercial. Wow. Well, that's good to know. And he will draw a lot of crowd for sure. He's beloved by all, you end the book with saying Broadway is in the midst of a golden age. Do you still think that
this golden age will continue post-COVID?
It's going to take some time to come back, but I do think that with the success of Broadway in the 1990s and into the 2000s, with shows like The Lion King and Wicked and Hamilton, I don't think people will ever forget Broadway. People love those shows. You know, people go back to see Wicked again and again and again. I mean, you know, people have gone back to see The Phantom over and over again. If somebody said to you, hey, I got a ticket to Hamilton tonight, you'd cancel all your plans and go see Hamilton.
Yes.
As long as we have the artists, and I think we will continue to have the artists, the Lin-Manuel Mirandas, the Hugh Jackmans, producers like Scott Rudin, Idina Menzel, writers like, you know, Edward Albee and Jonathan Larson. I don't fear for the long-term future of the art form. I think it's going to be a struggle to get us back there, but I do think that the theater is always going to attract great writers, great composers, great performers. And, you know, as long as it does, there's going to be a Broadway and there's going to be a theater across America.
Well, that's good to hear. And, you know, you seem to know a lot of people. What are you hearing on your end as far as the return goes? I mean, are the people just that are leading this sort of just excited to bring it back? Are they focused more on, you know?
They're ready to go. They're ready to go. But, you know, they can't.
Well, right.
They can't go until it's not going to happen until there's a vaccine. It's simply not. And frankly, I don't think it's going to happen until 2022. So we're looking basically another year of no Broadway.
So do you think they'll want to come back at full capacity? You mean as like being 2022, or you mean that will probably even be when it's
it'll be
half capacity,
gradual steps. It'll be 25%, 50%, but we don't know. I mean, Ryan, we just don't know. I mean, look,
of course not.
I you know, you and I live in the city, and I thought over the summer, I think we're kind of beyond this pandemic. I mean, outdoor dining was great here in the West Village where I live. It was, you know, it was kind of life as usual. And all of a sudden we're looking at spikes of the coronavirus everywhere, and we're looking at another potential lockdown. So I cannot tell you what it's going to look like when it comes out. All I can tell you is that the theater's been around for 3,000 years, and there's maybe just a little blip, but once we get past it, it'll be back. Yes,
it will. And what is your advice for aspiring writers on getting started and wanting to publish their works? You know, whether it's theater or other sort of topics, what advice do you have for them?
You know, I do fundamentally believe in the theater, and I've experienced this myself, and also as a writer myself. Mm-hmm. You have to find your contemporaries, group of people your own age, who want to change things and do things.
Yeah.
You can write a play and you can send it to an agent, and maybe they like it, maybe they don't. You know, you can go to an audition and maybe they like you, maybe they don't. But the way people really rise up in this business is they're young, they're contemporaries, they want to change things. And then one of them kind of gets a leg up, maybe gets that directing job for a play off Broadway, and says, you know what, my friends, the actors that I was in that show with in college or just out of college, I want to use her, I want to use him in the thing. And you kind of rise up together as contemporaries. I think it's a mistake for people to think, I'm young and I want Scott Rudin to read my play. Chances are Scott Rudin is probably not going to see your play. But if you and your friends create your own theater, you start doing your own stuff, you start working together, building a kind of theater that you love, that you want to create, that you want to change, as Jonathan Larson did. He wanted to change the theater. He thought theater is no longer for young people. I have to make it accessible again. And he did that with all of his contemporaries. I mean, you know, all the kids of Rent, they were all the same age. They're in their 20s and their early 30s, all struggling.
Yeah.
So you have to be in that community of people who want to change things. And if your material is good, if your work is good, I guarantee you, somebody like the New York Times or Michael Riedel, they will see it and they will find it. And when they write about it, that's when your career will begin. But don't chase what's going on now. Come up with something that none of us could ever have even imagined and just change it. I mean, if you're young, you have nothing to lose. You might as well blow it all up and try something different.
And now's sort of the perfect time to do it in this COVID era too. I mean, you know, when there is really, you know, not a lot going on, you have the time to do so, I would think.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
as we finish up, where can we purchase this book? Where can people buy it? Where can we get Singular Sensation, The Triumph of Broadway?
Well, of course, you can get everything on Amazon, but I'm a big believer in independent booksellers. So if you happen to have a bookstore in your neighborhood, in your town, do me a favor and go to the bookstore and tell them, I want Singular Sensation, so they have to order it. But try to buy it from an independent bookseller, because those guys need a lot of help these days.
They really do. They really do. And as we finish off, is there any last thoughts you'd like to leave us with? Anything you'd like to tell us that we didn't touch on, or any lasting sort of words?
I would say as difficult as the times are right now for the theater, as long as the title of my first book, I love John Kander and Fred Ebb, the two great composers. And I love Fred's words, give him the old razzle dazzle. And if you do that in the theater, people will come to see your show.
Yeah, they really will. They really will. Well, it has been an absolute pleasure to talk with you, Michael. Thank you so much. This book is absolutely incredible. Any theater fan out there, I recommend you run and get this book. As I was saying to Michael earlier, this book, I just read it from cover to cover. I salivated over it as a theater fan. You will love it. And even if you already knew what happened in this era, there's a lot in here, a lot of good, juicy scoop, but also a lot of historical information as well. So pick up your copy today of Singular Sensation. And Michael, thank you for doing this.
A pleasure, Rye. Take care of yourself. Stay